On the evening of July 29, 2014, an elderly couple living in an apartment building in the western part of Pocheon City, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, were getting ready for bed. It was still hot outside, so the apartment windows were open. The couple heard a child crying somewhere. At first, they tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and louder. The couple realized the noise was coming from the neighboring apartment on the second floor. They tried knocking on the door, but no one answered, and the crying grew louder and louder. People clearly heard the voice of a little boy repeatedly calling, "Where is my mommy? I want to go to my mommy." This seemed strange to them because everyone knew the apartment belonged to a woman who rarely visited. No one had seen the child with her. Neighbors called emergency services. Police and an ambulance quickly arrived at the house. After several unsuccessful attempts to gain entry, they decided to break down the door, but it was firmly locked. Seeing no other option, the police officers decided to use a fire escape to enter the apartment through a window. Once inside, they saw a room crammed with junk. Huge blue bags filled with garbage were everywhere. The foul stench made breathing impossible. The floors and doors were rotten, the walls cracked, and the furniture covered with a thick layer of dust and mold. It was hard to believe anyone could live in such conditions. Following the sounds of crying, the police found a young boy in the master bedroom. He looked 5 or 6 years old. He was very thin and weak, and his ribs were clearly visible. His eyes were cloudy and slightly blue, and his gaze was unfocused. Despite the commotion around him, the boy didn't immediately notice that people were nearby. He continued to cry and stare at the television screen. When he saw the police officers, his crying grew even louder. He was afraid of the uninvited guests. The police officers gently and carefully calmed the child. When they asked him why he was alone, he mumbled something unintelligible. Given the boy's critical condition, he was immediately taken to the hospital and fed. Everyone was surprised at how he handled his food. He carefully divided it into small portions, eating only one and leaving the rest for later. The medical staff tried to persuade the child to eat a whole portion at once, but he refused. This continued for a while. He stubbornly stuck to his method of dividing the food. After the boy was taken to the hospital, the police began to search the apartment. At first, they thought the source of the unbearable stench was the piles of garbage, but when they entered the second room opposite the master bedroom, the smell became many times worse. The officers carefully opened the door. This room, too, was littered with garbage. In the middle stood a large red plastic container, 90 centimeters high and 80 centimeters in diameter. Such containers are used for preparing the Korean national dish, kimchi, in very large quantities. It stood out clearly from the general chaos. Next to it lay a cell phone. On the lid of the container was a 10-kilogram bag of salt. The police decided to take a look inside. There they found a purple blanket, and underneath it, a body in advanced decomposition, submerged in a liquid. The container was taken away for further examination and forensic analysis. When they turned it over to drain the liquid and remove the remains, everyone saw a jumble of human bones and two skulls. It became clear that there were two bodies in the container. They were stacked on top of each other with a thin blanket between them that served as a kind of partition. The forensic examination revealed that the remains belonged to men between 40 and 50 years old. The victim on top had died about a year ago. 3 loops were formed from a scarf around the neck, and the head was tightly wrapped in plastic wrap. The victim lying underneath had died about 10 years ago. The container was filled with salt, which, together with the body fluids, had formed a foul-smelling broth. The murderer probably covered the bodies with salt to slow the decomposition process. One finger survived from the body lying on top. A partial fingerprint was visible on it. This was forwarded to the relevant authorities to attempt to reconstruct the complete print. This would help determine the victim's identity. News of the horrific discovery in one of the city apartments quickly spread throughout the area. The police immediately formed a 60-member special task force. Their first task was to thoroughly question the people who lived near the apartment where the incident had occurred. They hoped to find the boy's parents, who were most likely involved in the murder of the two men who had been preserved in a container. According to neighbors, the apartment belonged to a 51-year-old woman named Ms. Lee who hadn't lived there for a long time. She used to come by every few days, spend only a few minutes in the apartment, and then leave. She was last seen 20 days ago. Ms. Lee was found to have a 28-year-old son who lives in the city of Pocheon. Police tracked him down. And he said the boy they found was his younger brother, who is actually 8 years old. They have the same mother but different fathers. The 8-year-old boy's father was not involved in his upbringing. Shortly after his son's birth, the man's visa expired, so he returned home and cut off contact with Ms. Lee. When asked about his biological father, the boy replied that his name was Mr. Park. He hadn't heard from him in 10 years. The boy lived with his mother until he was 18, after which he moved to Pocheon to live with his grandparents. He admitted that he never paid much attention to his younger brother. He rarely had contact with his mother. Little is known about Ms. Lee. She was born in Jeonju in 1963. After moving to Pocheon, she found work at a confectionery factory. She suffered from chronic depression and had a volatile personality which made people reluctant to deal with her. The situation with her husband was very mysterious and strange. After moving to Pocheon, Mr. Park found work at a pig farm. After some time, he disappeared without a trace. Mr. Park's parents said they lost contact with their son 10 years ago. He had a mistress with whom he eloped. Police tried to track Mr. Park down using bank statements and medical records but found nothing. His trail went cold in 2004. It was later discovered that the cell phone found near a container in Ms. Lee's apartment belonged to Mr. Park. It continued to be paid for until 2013. A call came in from the same number at regular intervals. The police discovered that this number belonged to a man who had worked with Ms. Lee. He was tracked down and interrogated. He said Ms. Lee had given him the number and asked him to call regularly, paying him a small sum of money for this. Usually no one answered the phone, and only in 2013 did a woman call and tell him not to call again. Since the phone was found in Ms. Lee's apartment, it was clear that she answered the call. But why she had done all this remained mystery. The police issued a nationwide arrest warrant for Ms. Lee. Since it was known that she worked at a local candy factory, the officers went there immediately, but it turned out that she had left work an hour early that day. To determine where Ms. Lee had gone, the police reviewed street surveillance camera footage and saw her leave the factory premises and quickly walk toward the dormitories where mainly immigrants live. At some point, Ms. Lee disappeared from view, but the police were certain that she had not left the industrial area and immediately deployed all forces to the area. They searched the dormitories and questioned the factory workers, but they could not find Ms. Lee. Then the police decided to track her cell phone, but it had been switched off for several days. The call log showed that Ms. Lee called the same person every day at about the same time and spoke with him for about 10 minutes. Investigators quickly identified the man and visited him at his home. He was a 44-year-old man from Sri Lanka who had come to South Korea to work in a textile factory. He lived in a dormitory in an industrial area where Ms. Lee had last been seen. The police suspected that Ms. Lee was hiding with this man and wanted to search the apartment, but he just shook his head and said he didn't understand Korean. 2 days later, the police returned with a search warrant. The man silently opened the door wider and pointed to a closet. Inside, they found Ms. Lee. Since she was wearing only underwear, it was assumed she had hastily hidden when she heard the knock on the door. Ms. Lee was arrested and taken to the police station. She repeatedly repeated the same phrase, "I'm so sorry," During interrogation, she was first asked why her 8-year-old son had been alone in the apartment for at least 20 days. She replied, "I thought he was dead, so I didn't want to go back there." The woman could not offer a plausible explanation for why the child was in such terrible condition. By the time Ms. Lee began asking questions about the bodies found in a container, investigators had already identified one of the victims. Experts were able to reconstruct the fingerprint of a man whose remains were found in the upper part of the container. This was 49-year-old Mr. Lee, her lover. He had once worked with Ms. Lee at the candy factory and had been her lover. Ms. Lee said she began a romantic relationship with Mr. Lee in 2012. They moved in together 2 months later. Ms. Lee suggested Mr. Lee give her his salary so she could manage their joint budget for all expenses. The man agreed but later regretted it. At work, the two had to keep their relationship secret because company policy prohibited dating colleagues. When the director accidentally found out about the affair, he considered Mr. Lee's behavior inappropriate and immediately fired him. According to the documents, Ms. Lee was still married even though her husband was reported missing. The director believed Mr. Lee had exploited her vulnerability for his own purposes. The couple's relationship continued for a while but gradually began to deteriorate. Mr. Lee couldn't find a new job, started drinking, and blamed Ms. Lee for everything. The woman was tired of putting up with it and left Mr. Lee in May 2013. The man was furious. He believed that he had lost his job because of Ms. Lee and that she had now left him. Mr. Lee also began to suspect that Ms. Lee was cheating on him. He gave her his entire salary and she used it as she saw fit. The man believed she now owed him 4.5 million won, equivalent to more than $3,000 in current dollars. Ms. Lee tried to explain that the money had been used for their shared living arrangements, including her salary, and so she wouldn't pay anything back, but Mr. Lee refused to listen. For the next 2 months, he terrorized Ms. Lee. He visited her at work and home, demanding repayment of the debt. Each of their meetings inevitably ended in a heated argument. In July 2013, Mr. Lee came to Ms. Lee's home and demanded his money back. The woman tried to remain calm. She offered the man a seat and a drink. He agreed, but he persisted. Mr. Lee begged Ms. Lee to return the money and threatened her. At one point, the woman said firmly, "If you continue to behave like this, I will not return the money. I will kill you and then do the same to myself." When Mr. Lee heard these words, he could no longer contain his anger. He cursed and slapped Ms. Lee violently in the face. Unable to bear this humiliation, Ms. Lee suddenly stood up and threw Mr. Lee to the ground with all her strength. She sat on him and began choking him with both hands. Then she took a scarf, wrapped it around his neck 3 times, and pulled it tight. Mr. Lee struggled desperately, but his body seemed to no longer obey him and his limbs went limp. It turned out that Ms. Lee had slipped strong sleeping pills into his drink. When the man showed no signs of life, Ms. Lee stood up. She looked at his body and felt no remorse. To make sure he didn't regain consciousness, she wrapped his head tightly in plastic wrap. She then wrapped the body blanket and carried it to the guest room. For a while, Ms. Lee ignored her former lover's lifeless body, but when it began to decompose and emit a foul odor, she decided to place it in a plastic container. She sprinkled a large amount of salt over it, hoping it would dampen the smell, and sealed the container tightly. After hearing this story, the police officers asked Ms. Lee about the other victim whose remains were at the bottom of the container. She calmly replied that it was a foreigner she had met by chance on the street. He had demanded money from her, but Ms. Lee had refused to give him any. A fight had broken out and she had accidentally killed the man. While she was wondering what to do with the body, a stranger came by. Ms. Lee asked for his help, promising him 1 million won, about $720 today. According to Ms. Lee, the man helped her drag the body into her apartment and place it in a kimchi container. The police listened to Ms. Lee's story and realized she was lying, but they had no evidence. Fortunately, the situation soon changed. Forensic experts managed to secure DNA from the second victim, and after an examination, they were able to determine his identity. The body belonged to Mr. Park, Ms. Lee's husband. When the woman was questioned again, she changed her story but assured investigators that she had not harmed him. One morning 10 years ago, Ms. Lee had found her husband on the balcony. He showed no signs of life. Shocked, she didn't know what to do. Out of love for her husband, she placed his body in a container, hoping he would stay with her. Forever, Ms. Lee's story sounded implausible. The police again doubted the veracity of her statement, but still had no evidence against her. Meanwhile, forensic pathologists continued to examine the bodies of Mr. Lee and Mr. Park to determine the cause of death. On August 7, they informed police that doxylamine had been found in their bodies. This is a chemical component of prescription sleep aids which have a sedative effect and help people fall into a deep sleep quickly. However, in an overdose, doxylamine inhibits respiratory function, which can lead to a coma and even death. It turned out that Ms. Lee had been taking a doctor-prescribed sleep aid containing doxylamine for many years. In addition, a week before Mr. Lee's disappearance, Ms. Lee had purchased the pills from a nearby pharmacy and presented the prescription. This indirectly confirmed that she had poisoned Mr. Lee before strangling him. When police presented evidence that doxylamine had also been found in Mr. Park's body, Ms. Lee changed her statement and told the following story. In 1985, Ms. Lee worked at a sewing factory in Seoul. She was 22 at the time. There she met a man named Mr. Park, who was a year older than her. The couple quickly began a romantic relationship, and Ms. Lee became pregnant. The couple decided to move to Pocheon, where Mr. Park's parents lived. There they officially married, and soon after their first son was born, followed 3 years later by their second. The pig farm where Mr. Park worked was quite far from their home, so he persuaded Ms. Lee to move so he wouldn't have to spend so much time commuting. Until 1995, the family lived a relatively happy life until one day an accident occurred. The younger son, who was 6 years old at the time, was returning home from school. He was standing at an intersection waiting for the green light. Suddenly, a truck came around a bend at high speed. The driver lost control of his vehicle and it overturned. Sand poured from the cargo area onto the 6-year-old boy. Unfortunately, he died at the scene. The loss of their child was a tragedy for the entire family, but it hit Ms. Lee particularly hard psychologically. She was diagnosed with depression. To treat her anxiety and insomnia, her doctor prescribed strong sedatives and sleeping pills. The tragedy also negatively impacted the couple's relationship. Ms. Lee claimed that her son would still be alive if they hadn't moved to the area at her husband's insistence. Mr. Park, in turn, blamed Ms. Lee, arguing that, as a mother, she should have taken better care of her child, dropping him off at school and picking him up. The daily arguments and mutual accusations continued for several years. Gradually, the couple became estranged. Mr. Park stayed late at work and sometimes even didn't return home for several days. In 2003, Mr. Park began an affair and spent a lot of time with his new lover. Once, he disappeared for a whole month. When Ms. Lee learned where her husband was, her anger at him intensified and she wanted revenge. She began meeting and dating men, but Mr. Park didn't care. He didn't react to his wife's behavior. In 2004, when Ms. Lee's mental condition became critical, she decided to take more radical revenge on her husband. One autumn evening, she gave him a glass of water in which she had dissolved a large amount of sleeping pills and blood pressure medication. At the time, Mr. Park was suffering from a sinus infection, and Ms. Lee said she had prepared a remedy for the inflammation. Ms. Lee watched her husband die in front of her, but showed no emotion. Once she was convinced that Mr. Park was dead, she wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in a kimchi container. After her husband's death, Ms. Lee skillfully concealed the truth, giving various reasons for Mr. Park's absence. She even fabricated a story that Mr. Park had run off with another woman. Everyone knew about the couple's difficult relationship and believed Ms. Lee's words. Everyone felt sorry for her, and Mr. Park's parents even felt guilty that their son had done such a thing to his family. After getting rid of her husband, Ms. Lee continued to lead a chaotic life. She had brief affairs with numerous men and often brought them home with her. In 2006, Ms. Lee gave birth to a boy with a Bangladeshi man with whom she had a brief affair. Ms. Lee showed neither anticipation nor joy at the birth of the child. She often neglected the child's care and failed to fulfill her maternal duties. After her lover, Mr. Lee, disappeared from her life in 2013, she constantly left her son home alone. While she initially stayed away for a few hours, she soon stayed away for several days. To distract the child and drown his crying, she always played the television loudly. Ms. Lee only came home for a few minutes to bring the child something to eat. Usually it was milk and bread that she had bought at the nearest store. The boy spent his entire 8 years of life indoors. He was never outside and had no contact with other people. The child was constantly hungry. He immediately ate the bread and milk his mother brought him and went hungry for the rest of the day. Over time, he realized that he had to share food and eat only a little to last longer because he didn't know when his mother would visit him again. Due to malnutrition, the boy was very thin and much smaller than other children his age. At 8, he looked 5 or 6. The child's only entertainment was watching television. Experts believe that this is why his eyes turned blue, as he was constantly in a dimly lit room and stared at the television screen all day. Initially, police suspected that the Sri Lankan man with whom Ms. Lee was hiding might be their accomplice, but the suspicion was dropped when it was discovered that he had only arrived in South Korea 6 months earlier. In February 2015, Ms. Lee's case went to court. She was charged with double murder, concealing a corpse, and child abuse. The woman was sentenced to 24 years in prison but disagreed with the sentence, appealed, and again changed her statement. Ms. Lee began claiming that her husband, Mr. Park, had died of natural causes. She had only hidden his body because she loved him very much and didn't want to be separated from him. Her older son confirmed this statement, adding that he had helped his mother place his father's body in a container. The boy agreed to undergo a lie detector test. To everyone's surprise, he told the truth. Despite this, no charges could be brought against him because in South Korea, the statute of limitations for concealing a crime is 7 years. The prosecution could not prove that Ms. Lee was involved in her husband's death, although doxylamine was found in his system. The exact dosage could not be determined. Therefore, even if Ms. Lee had planted drugs in her husband's body, it could not be claimed that the amount would have been lethal. Therefore, the charge of murdering her husband was dropped. The final conviction was also influenced by the woman's unstable mental state. It turned out that, in addition to long-term depression, she also suffered from borderline personality disorder, which is why she was ultimately sentenced to 18 years in prison. Ms. Lee attempted to appeal the verdict, but all her attempts were unsuccessful. A criminal psychologist who spoke with Ms. Lee and examined her case concluded that she also suffered from compulsive hoarding. People with this diagnosis never throw anything away. For them, there is simply no such thing as trash. Every object is extremely important. This explains not only why Ms. Lee's apartment was cluttered with junk, but also her desire to preserve the bodies of her husband and former lover. Her older son recounted that his mother began behaving strangely after the death of her child in 1995. She began collecting various objects. For a while, her husband and son made sure Ms. Lee didn't clutter the apartment, but when she was alone, no one stopped her, so she let her apartment fall into disrepair. The fate of Ms. Lee's youngest son is unknown. He was cared for by social services for a while. He faced a difficult path of adjustment and integration into society. I hope he made it. He should be 18 years old by now. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.